Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts. We've built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, created the internet. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. However, if you had looked at the world 900,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. There were barely 1,280 humans left alive on the entire planet. Not 1.28 million, not 128,000, just 1,280 breeding individuals. That's it. The entire future of humanity hanging by a thread, so thin it's almost impossible to believe we're here today. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where are you and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. You know that feeling when you realize how close you came to disaster. Like when you slam on the brakes and miss that truck by inches. That's what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a split second, it was 117,000 years of barely hanging on. And here's the really crazy part. Nobody knew this happened until 2023. See, scientists had always suspected humans went through some kind of population crash in our distant past. Our genetic diversity is weirdly low compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, who live in small groups, scattered across Africa, have way more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. That's the signature of a bottleneck. But nobody knew how severe it was. Nobody knew it almost ended everything before it really began. The story starts with a guy named Wang Zhu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences 5 years ago. He's running genetic analysis on modern human populations, trying to understand our evolutionary history. Standard stuff. He's looking at DNA from over 3,000 people from around the world, tracking mutations backward through time like a molecular clock. Then he sees something weird in the data. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures just collapse. It's like watching a movie where suddenly 99% of the actors disappear from the screen. The mathematical models are screaming that something catastrophic happened, but then numbers are so extreme, who doesn't believe them at first? He thinks it's an error, a glitch in his analysis, because if these calculations are right, then human ancestors were reduced to a population smaller than a typical high school. He spends years double-checking, triple-checking, running the analysis again and again with different methods. Every time the same result. 98.7% of human ancestors were wiped out around 930,000 years ago, and the survivors stayed at critically low numbers for over 100,000 years. Now that's longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Now you might think, okay, so our ancestors went through a tough time. Big deal. Species bounce back from near extinction all the time, right? Wrong. When populations get this small, they don't usually bounce back, they die. Mathematical models show that once you're down to around 1,000 individuals, you're in what biologists call the extinction vortex. Genetic problems pile up. Inbreeding increases. Random disasters can wipe out the whole group. Most species that hit numbers this low just vanish forever. But somehow, our ancestors didn't vanish. For 117,000 years they held on. Through ice ages, through droughts, through the extinction of countless other species, a tiny population of early humans spread across who knows where, keeping the flame of humanity alive when it should have been snuffed out. What makes this discovery even more incredible is the timing. 900,000 years ago puts us right in the middle of what geologists call the early, middle, Pleiadian transition. This was when Earth's climate went completely insane. Before this period, ice ages came and went in relatively predictable 41,000-year cycles. The planet would get cold, ice sheets would grow, then things would warm up again. Tough, but manageable. But around 900,000 years ago, everything changed. The Ice Age cycles shifted to brutal 100,000-year patterns. Glaciers became massive, covering huge chunks of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, ocean temperatures plummeted, and in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became incredibly harsh and dry. Picture this. You're an early human, maybe Homo erectus or one of their descendants, living in what used to be lush woodland. Over generations, your world is transforming into an arid wasteland. Water sources are disappearing. The animals you hunt are going extinct. Plant foods are becoming scarce. And it's not getting better. It's getting worse for thousands and thousands of years. This is what scientists call a perfect storm for mass extinction. And that's exactly what happened to most human populations. They were wiped out. Only a tiny group somewhere in Africa managed to survive. We don't know where exactly, we don't know how, but they did. Now here's where the story gets even more mind-bending. During this bottleneck period, something unprecedented happened to human genetics. 2 of our ancestral chromosomes fused together, just merged into one. This is why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is incredibly rare. It happens maybe once in millions of years, and it happened right in the middle of our near-extinction event. This wasn't a coincidence. See, when populations are very small, unusual genetic changes can spread through the entire group much faster than normal. If one individual had this chromosome fusion and survived to produce, their children would carry it. And in a population of only 1,280 people, a genetic change like this could become universal within a few generations. Today, every human on Earth carries this fused chromosome. All 8 billion of us. It's chromosome 2, and it contains the genetics signature of those desperate 117,000 years when humanity nearly died out. Scientists can actually point to the exact spot where the fusion happened. They can see the molecular scars where 2 ancient chromosomes joined together. It's like forensic evidence from the most important crime scene in human history. But the chromosome fusion did more than just reduce our chromosome count. Some researchers believe it may have triggered changes in brain development. Genes near the fusion site affect neural function. It's possible that the genetic shakeup during the bottleneck contributed to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Think about that. Our intelligence, our ability to create art and music and technology, our capacity for language and abstract thought, all of it might trace back to a genetic accident that happened when there were barely 1,000 humans left on Earth. The evidence for this bottleneck is written in our DNA like a time capsule. Every person alive today carries the molecular signature of those 117,000 years of survival. Population geneticists can see it in the patterns of genetic variation, the mathematical fingerprint of near extinction. But for decades, nobody could interpret the signal correctly. See, older genetic analysis methods were like trying to read a book through a keyhole. Scientists could detect that something had happened in our past, but they couldn't see the full picture. They knew humans had been through at least one major population bottleneck. Probably when our ancestors left Africa around 60,000 years ago, but they had no idea there was an earlier, much more severe one. It took the development of new computational tools like the Fitcol method that Wangju and his team created to finally crack the code. These new techniques can analyze thousands of genomes simultaneously and trace genetic changes back nearly 1 million years. When Hu first published his findings in the journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned, not just because of how severe the bottleneck was, but because of how long it lasted. Most population bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively short. A volcanic eruption wipes out most of a species, then the survivors rapidly multiply to fill the empty ecological niche, or a disease kills off 90% of a population, but the remaining 10% recover within a few generations. but 117,000 years. That's not a bottleneck. That's more like an extended near-death experience for an entire species. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, put it best. This would imply that the surviving population occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion for it to survive. Of greater surprise is the estimated length of time that this small group survived. If this is correct, then one imagines that it would require a stable environment with sufficient resources and few stresses to the system. In other words, somewhere in Africa there was a pocket of stability, a refuge where a small group of early humans found everything they needed to survive while the rest of the continent was being ravaged by climate change. But where was this refuge? What made it special? How did thou hound 180 people manage to maintain a stable population for over 100,000 years? These are the questions that keep scientists up at night. Some researchers think the survivors lived near reliable water sources, maybe around the Great Lakes of East Africa, or along rivers that kept flowing even when the climate turned harsh. Water means animals come to drink. Animals mean food, and both water and food mean survival. Others believe the survivors had developed crucial technologies that other human populations lacked. Maybe they had figured out how to control fire more effectively. Fire changes everything. It lets you cook food, which makes more nutrients available. It keeps predators away. It extends the day, giving you more time to work and socialize. Most importantly, it lets you survive in environments that would otherwise kill you. Archaeological evidence shows that around 800,000 years ago, there was a sudden increase in the use of fire by human populations. This timing matches almost perfectly with when the genetic bottleneck ended and human populations began to expand again. Coincidence? Probably not. But here's the thing that really blows your mind. The fossil record from this period is almost completely empty. Between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, there are hardly any human fossils found anywhere in Africa or Europe. For a long time, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and couldn't explain it. Now we know why. There simply weren't many humans around to leave fossils behind. With only 1 through 180 breeding individuals scattered across who knows how much territory, the chances of any of them dying in conditions that would preserve their bones for hundreds of thousands of years were incredibly small. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except there are barely any needles, and the haystack is the size of a continent. The few fossils we do have from this period are mostly from Europe and Asia, not Africa, which means they probably represent human populations that weren't directly part of the bottleneck. Maybe the severe population crash only affected certain groups of early humans, while others in different regions managed to survive in slightly larger numbers. This makes sense when you think about it. Africa is a huge continent with diverse climates and ecosystems. While some regions might have become uninhabitable during the climate crisis, others might have remained relatively stable. But the genetic evidence is clear. The ancestors of all modern humans plus Neanderthals and Denisovans went through this extreme bottleneck. We're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every single person reading this story carries DNA from that tiny population that refused to give up during the worst climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate that we lost about 65% of our total genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That's an enormous amount. For comparison, the famous founder effect when modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago only reduced genetic diversity by about 15%. This loss of genetic diversity has consequences we're still living with today. It's why humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases, why we have relatively weak immune systems compared to other primates, why genetic disorders that would be rare in more diverse populations are relatively common in humans. In a twisted way, our weakness is proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry is evidence that our ancestors we're tough. Enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. But the story doesn't end with survival. The most incredible part is what happened next. Around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The population of early humans began to grow again. Not slowly, not gradually, rapidly. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,080 survivors had spread across Africa and beyond. They developed new technologies. They created more sophisticated tools. They began to hunt larger animals more effectively. They started building shelters and controlling fire more systematically. Most importantly, they began the evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to three of the most successful species in human history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. The genetic evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of all three species lived right around the time the bottleneck ended, as if the near-extinction event didn't just test our ancestors' survival skills, it forged them into something new, something stronger, something more adaptable, something that could not just survive in a hostile world, but eventually dominate it. Ye Huanpan, one of the scientists who discovered the bottleneck, put it this way: "The novel finding opens a new field in human evolution because it evokes many questions such as the places where these individuals lived, how they overcame the catastrophic climate changes, and whether natural selection during the bottleneck has accelerated the evolution of human brain." That last part is crucial: natural selection during the bottleneck. When population sizes are extremely small, evolution doesn't work the way it normally does. Usually, genetic changes spread slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations take hundreds of generations to become common. Harmful ones take time to disappear. But in a population of 1,280 individuals, evolution moves at lightning speed. Beneficial traits can spread through the entire group within a few generations. Individuals with even slight advantages in survival or reproduction can quickly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors were basically living in an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the smartest, toughest, most adaptable individuals survived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation after generation of intense natural selection, selecting for exactly the traits that would later make humans so successful: problem-solving ability, social cooperation, tool use, communication skills, the capacity to learn and adapt quickly to changing environments. All of these traits were probably being refined and amplified during those 17,000 years of near extinction. The genetic bottleneck wasn't just something our ancestors survived, it was something that made them and us who we are. But what did that actually look like, living through 117,000 years of evolutionary hell? Let's go back, way back. It's 930,000 years. Ego and the world is ending. Not in some dramatic explosion or asteroid impact. Slowly, brutally, one failed harvest at a time. You're part of a small band of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 individuals. Your species doesn't even have a name yet: Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. Scientists still argue about the details. What matters is you're human enough that your children's children, thousands of generations later, will eventually become us. And right now you're watching your world disappear. The forests where your parents hunted are turning into scrubland. The scrubland is turning into desert. Rivers that ran year-round are now seasonal streams, then just dry beds marked with cracked mud. Your band moves constantly, following water sources that keep drying up, following herds that keep getting smaller, following hope that keeps getting dimmer. This isn't a drought. Droughts end. This is the new normal. The Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmare configuration. Ice sheets in the north are growing massive. locking up so much water that sea levels drop by hundreds of feet. The Mediterranean becomes a series of smaller lakes. Land bridges appear between continents. But it's not the ice that's killing your people, it's what the ice does to Africa. See, when huge ice sheets form in the north, they create a kind of atmospheric dam. Weather patterns that used to bring regular rains to Africa get disrupted. The monsoons that fed the continent's rivers become weak and erratic. What used to be woodland becomes grassland, grassland becomes desert, and desert becomes nothing. Scientists have a name for what happened to Africa during this period: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it got catastrophically drier. Fossil evidence shows that most of the large mammals went extinct. Antelope species that had thrived for millions of years just vanished. Elephant populations crashed. When the big animals die out, everything else follows. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and anything that depended on hunting or scavenging like early humans faces a choice. Adapt or die. Most chose poorly. But your small band, your group of 1,280 individuals scattered across the continent, you found something the others missed. Maybe it was a mountain range that still caught enough rainfall to support a few trees. Maybe it was an underground aquifer that kept springs flowing when everything else dried up. Maybe it was a rift valley that created its own microclimate. Whatever it was, it worked for 117,000 years. Now let's talk about what working actually meant. Forget everything you think you know about human evolution being a steady march toward progress. There was no progress during the bottleneck. There was only survival. Your band probably lived in groups of 20 to 30 people, extended families, everyone related to everyone else within a few generations. You had to be with only 180 breeding individuals total. You couldn't afford to be picky about who you partnered with. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders probably common. Birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, all the consequences of a gene pool that's way too small. But somehow you persisted. The daily routine was brutal. Wake up, find water, find food, don't get killed. Repeat for 100,000 years. Water came first, always. In a landscape where most streams ran dry half the year, knowing where to find reliable water sources meant the difference between life and death. Your people probably developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to spot signs of underground water, to predict which seasonal streams would flow longest. You might have learned to dig wells, simple ones, maybe just holes scraped out with sticks and stones. But even a crude well that reached groundwater could sustain a family through a dry season. Food was harder. With most of the large game extinct, you couldn't rely on hunting the way your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists called dietary generalists. You ate everything. Insects, always insects. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae. Pound for pound, insects are some of the most nutritious food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations can be harvested sustainably. You ate roots, tubers, anything that grew underground where it was protected from the heat and drought. You learned which plants were edible during different seasons, which ones were toxic and less prepared properly, which ones could be stored for lean times. You became an expert at finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything with protein. You probably learned to follow certain animals to their nesting grounds, timing your raids for maximum yield without destroying future breeding. And occasionally, when you got lucky, you found meat. Not the massive woolly mammoths your ancestors hunted in groups of dozens. Those were long gone. But smaller animals, a young antelope separated from its herd, an injured zebra, an old elephant dying of thirst. This is where fire became crucial. Early humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but during the bottleneck, fire wasn't just useful, it was the difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it safer to eat, killed parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family. More importantly, cooking broke down tough proteins and made nutrients more available. You could get more calories from the same amount of food. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. Many roots and tubers are indigestible or even poisonous when raw, but cook them and they become major sources of carbohydrates. Some researchers think this is when humans first learned to process plant food systematically. But fire did more than just improve your diet. It extended your day. Without artificial light, most animals are helpless after dark. Predators hunt, prey, hide. Everyone's basically shut down until sunrise, but with fire, your band could stay active after sunset. You could work on tools, repair, shelters, share information about where you'd found water or food. Most importantly, you could strengthen social bonds, and social bonds were everything during the bottleneck. With groups this small, you couldn't afford conflict. Every individual was precious. Lose one adult to fighting or accidents or disease, and the whole band was weakened. Losses several, and you might not survive the next bad season. So, you developed cooperation skills that would make modern diplomats jealous. You learned to share resources even when resources were scarce. You learned to resolve disputes without violence. You learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them. Most crucially, you learned to share knowledge. When one person discovered a new water source, everyone learned about it. When someone figured out how to process a toxic plant to make it edible, that knowledge spread through the group immediately. When hunters developed a new technique for tracking game, it became common knowledge within days. This wasn't just being nice, it was survival strategy. In a population this small, losing accumulated knowledge when someone died could be catastrophic. So, you developed oral traditions, teaching methods, ways of passing information from one generation to the next. You became obsessive about teaching children not just basic skills, but everything. Where to find water in each season, which plants were safe, how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather patterns, how to make and maintain tools. Children who learned quickly had better chances of survival. Children who learned quickly had better chances of reproduction. Over thousands of generations, you were selecting for intelligence, for teaching ability, for the capacity to acquire and transmit complex information. You were evolving into something new. The genetic evidence suggests that during the bottleneck, human brain size began to increase, not dramatically. That would come later, but measurably. The cranial capacity of human fossils from just after the bottleneck period is noticeably larger than those from before. This makes sense. When survival depends on outsmarting your environment, natural selection favors bigger, more capable brains. Even if bigger brains require more energy that was desperately scarce during the crisis. But it wasn't just raw intelligence that was evolving, it was specifically social intelligence. Living in tiny groups for thousands of generations, you became incredibly skilled at reading other people, at predicting their behavior, at knowing when to trust, when to be cautious, when to share, when to withhold. You developed what psychologists call theory of mind. The ability to understand that other people have thoughts and intentions different from your own. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most complex cognitive abilities in the animal kingdom, and you were refining it under the most intense survival pressure imaginable. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, but what little we have is fascinating. Tools become more sophisticated, but also more standardized, as if small groups were developing consistent ways of making things and sharing those techniques widely. Stone tools from the late bottleneck period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence. similar designs appearing in different regions at roughly the same time. This suggests communication networks between groups, trade routes, maybe even regular gatherings where bands would meet to exchange not just goods, but knowledge and genes. Because here's the thing about those 1,280 breeding individuals, they weren't all living in one place. Basic population genetics tells us they had to be spread out. Put 1,280 people in one valley, and a single disaster, flood, drought, disease outbreak, volcanic eruption, could wipe them all out. Evolution doesn't make that kind of mistake, so they were scattered. Maybe groups of 20, 30 people separated by hundreds of miles, connected by networks of kinship and trade, but living independently enough that no single catastrophe could destroy them all. This created what biologists call a metapopulation structure, individual. Groups rising and falling, going extinct and being replaced, but the overall network surviving. It's like a game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are human populations and the hammers are droughts, diseases and climate disasters. Some groups get hit and disappear, but others survive, reproduce and send out migrants to repopulate the empty territories. For 117,000 years, this desperate game continued. Some generations probably lived relatively well, finding good territories with reliable resources. Others suffered terribly, watching children die of starvation and disease. But somehow the network held. And then around 13,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle. Slightly more reliable rainfall in some regions. Grasslands beginning to expand again after millennia of desert. Animal populations starting to recover. The extreme phase of the climate crisis was ending, but by this time, your people weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of intense natural selection had transformed them, made them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in harsh environments. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. Better tools, more sophisticated fire management, improved food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed social systems capable of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across multiple generations. When the climate began to improve, they were ready. Population growth was explosive. Within a few thousand years, descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread across Africa and begun expanding into Europe and Asia. They carried with them all the survival skills learned during the crisis, plus the genetic and cultural adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed certain. These weren't just any humans. These were humans who had been forged by the worst environmental crisis in our species' history. They were the ancestors of every human who would come after. Every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of the bottleneck. All evidence that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But the story was just beginning. What happened next changed everything. Picture this. Your ancestors have just survived the worst climate disaster in human history. For over 100,000 years, they've been living on the edge of extinction. Tiny groups scattered across Africa, clinging to whatever refuges they could find. Then the rains return. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, year by year, the grasslands start coming back. Rivers that had been dry for millennia begin to flow again. Animals that had vanished from vast regions start reappearing in small herds. And your people, your battle, hard-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined people, they exploded across the landscape like nothing the world had ever seen. Within just a few thousand years, which is basically nothing in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had multiplied into hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. They spread from whatever corner of Africa had sheltered them during the crisis and began colonizing territories that had been empty for ages. But here's where the story gets really wild. They weren't just expanding as one big, happy human family. The genetic bottleneck had done something unprecedented to human evolution. It had set the stage for the most important speciation event in our lineage. Around 800,000 years ago, that single population of survivors began splitting into three distinct groups, three separate evolutionary paths that would eventually become the three most successful human species in history. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. Now, speciation usually takes hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions. Species diverge slowly, accumulating differences generation by generation until they can no longer interbreed. But the bottleneck compressed and accelerated everything. Those 117,000 years of intense natural selection had created a kind of evolutionary spring-loading. When the population finally expanded, it exploded in multiple directions at once. Think of it like this. You take a river and force it through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. All that water pressure builds up. Then suddenly you move the constraint. The water doesn't just flow, it erupts in every direction, carving new channels, creating new pathways. That's what happened to human evolution after the bottleneck. The first group stayed in Africa. These would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens. But they weren't modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining the survival skills that had carried them through the crisis. The second group moved north and west into Europe and Western Asia. These populations found a very different world than the one their ancestors had known. Colder, more seasonal, full of new challenges and new opportunities. They adapted fast. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed the robust builds, enlarged nasal passages, and cold weather adaptations that would make them perfectly suited to Ice Age Europe. They became the Neanderthals. The third group went east, spreading across Asia, and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, but we know they existed because their DNA still shows up in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. They were the Denisovans. All three groups carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity, then neural adaptations that had been selected for during those brutal 117,000 years. But they also began developing their own unique traits. The African population that stayed behind faced a recovering but still challenging environment. They needed to be adaptable, innovative, capable of exploiting a wide range of resources. As the climate continued to fluctuate, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, the capacity to develop new technologies quickly when conditions changed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as the key features of modern humans. Larger brains relative to body size, more gracile bone structure, enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking. Most importantly, they developed what anthropologists call behavioral modernity, the ability to create art, use symbols, engage in abstract reasoning, the mental toolkit that would eventually let them dominate the planet. But that was still far in the future. For now, they were just one of three human species, all competing for resources in a world that was still recovering from the greatest climate disaster in human history. The Neanderthals, meanwhile, were becoming something else entirely. Moving into Europe during the recovery period, they encountered environments that were still brutally cold and seasonal. Winters that could last 8 months, summers that were brief and unpredictable. They adapted by becoming incredibly robust. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density and muscle mass that would make modern bodybuilders jealous. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the cold dry air, they breathed. Their brains actually grew larger than those of modern humans, possibly as an adaptation to the complex challenges of Ice Age survival. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters, not just opportunistic scavengers, like many of their predecessors, but systematic strategic predators capable of taking down massive Ice Age mammals. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups, driving large animals into kill zones. They figured out how to preserve meat through long winters, probably using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Most remarkably, they developed the first systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show evidence of intentional placement, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests they had developed symbolic thinking, the ability to conceive of death as something meaningful, something worthy of ritual. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were creating culture. The Denisovans were doing something similar in Asia, but we know less about their specific adaptations. What we do know is that they were incredibly successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations shows Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, indicating they spread across an enormous range of environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic variants that helped them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. These same genetic variants show up in modern Tibetan populations today, evidence that ancient humans and Denisovans interbred, passing on survival genes that are still helping people live at extreme altitudes. Other Denisovan groups seem to have been skilled seafarers. There's evidence they reached islands in Southeast Asia that would have required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills. This suggests they developed maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species. But here's what's really incredible about all three groups: they were still connected. Despite spreading across 3 continents and adapting to radically different environments, they remained genetically close enough to interbreed when their ranges overlapped. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors finally left Africa around 60,000 years ago. Denis interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans at various times and places. The genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over hundreds of thousands of years. This tells us something profound about the bottleneck and its aftermath. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had created a kind of genetic unity among all human populations. Despite evolving along different paths for hundreds of thousands of years, we were all still fundamentally the same species, all still carrying the chromosomal fusion that marked us as bottleneck survivors, all still sharing the basic genetic toolkit that had been refined during those desperate millennia. But each group was also developing its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of technological innovation, not just among one group, but among all three. In Africa, stone tool technology becomes increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for millions of years give way to carefully crafted spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for specific tasks. More importantly, tool-making becomes standardized. Archaeological sites from across Africa show remarkably similar tool designs, suggesting widespread communication and knowledge sharing between groups. This is the signature of true cultural evolution. Ideas spreading faster than genes, allowing rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own technological traditions. They created the first hafted tools, spear points, and knives attached to wooden handles with plant resins and animal CNS. This might sound simple, but it represents a major cognitive leap. You have to plan ahead, gather multiple materials, and understand abstract concepts. Like torque and leverage, they also developed what archaeologists call prepared core techniques for stone tool making. Instead of just chipping away at rocks until they got something useful, Neanderthals learned to carefully shape stone cores so they could produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. This is manufacturing planned, systematic production of standardized goods. The Denisovans were innovating too, though their achievements are harder to trace, but genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to develop systematic use of plant medicines. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help process plant toxins, suggesting their ancestors had learned to use poisonous plants as medicines, developing resistance through natural selection. They might also have been the first humans to practice systematic agriculture. Some researchers think the genetic variants that help digest starchy foods in modern Asian populations originated with Denisovans who had learned to cultivate and process wild grains. But perhaps the most important innovation was happening in the realm of social organization. All three post-bottleneck human species were developing increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups were forming alliances with other groups. Trade networks were emerging that could move raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of civilization. The genetic evidence for this social revolution is written in our DNA. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations show evidence of what geneticists call structured breeding patterns. Not random mating, but systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This suggests our ancestors had developed kinship systems, rules about who could marry whom, probably elaborate gift exchange networks that maintained relationships between distant communities. They were creating the social glue that would eventually allow human societies to scale up from small bands to tribes, chiefdoms, and eventually states. But they were also creating something else, something that would prove even more important. In the long run, language. Now, nobody knows exactly when human language evolved. It doesn't fossilize, we can only infer its development from indirect evidence. But everything points to the post-bottleneck period as the time when human communication became truly sophisticated. The rapid spread of standardized tool technologies suggests complex information transfer. The evidence of trade networks implies negotiation and abstract reasoning. The burial practices of Neanderthals indicate symbolic thinking. Most tellingly, the genetic bottleneck had created exactly the conditions under which complex language would be most advantageous. Small scattered populations trying to maintain connections across vast distances. Groups that needed to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities. Individuals whose survival depended on their ability to learn complex skills quickly and teach them to their children. Under these conditions, any improvement in communication ability would provide massive survival advantages. Individuals who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or convey information more effectively would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure would refine human communication abilities far beyond anything seen in other species. By the time the three human species encountered each other again, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans encountering both groups in Asia, they would have been capable of sophisticated verbal communication. They could share knowledge, negotiate alliances, even tell stories about their ancestors who had survived the great dying 900,000 years before. But they were also starting to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. Resources that had been abundant during the recovery period were becoming contested, and the three human species were beginning to compete directly for the same territories and the same resources. The age of cooperation was ending. The age of competition was about to begin. Then came the meeting that would decide the fate of humanity. 1,000 years ago, The descendants of those African survivors finally left their home continent. Not all of them, just a small group, maybe a few hundred individuals who decided to cross the narrow waters between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. They had no idea they were about to encounter their long-lost cousins. For over 400,000 years, the three human species had been evolving in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, each had become perfectly adapted to their own environments. Each had developed their own technologies, their own cultures, their own ways of surviving. Now they were about to meet face to face. The first encounter probably happened somewhere in the Middle East, maybe along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where African migrants would have encountered the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You're a modern human, part of Asmal band, exploring new lands. Your people have never seen other humans who look different from you. Then suddenly you spot them across a valley. They're human, but not quite. Shorter and more robust than your people. Faces that project forward with massive brow ridges and enormous nasal openings. Bodies built like wrestlers, all muscle and thick bone. Neanderthals, your first instinct might be fear or curiosity or aggression. We'll never know what those initial meetings were like, but we know what happened next because it's written in our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight for territory. They formed relationships, they had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over thousands of years. Today, everyone of non-African descent carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the genetic signature of those ancient encounters. Proof that when our species met, at least sometimes they chose cooperation over conflict. But cooperation has its limits. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between species. Climate would shift and modern humans would expand north, climate would shift again, and Neanderthals would push back south. For tens of thousands of years, the region changed hands repeatedly. Sometimes modern humans controlled the best hunting grounds. Sometimes Neanderthals did, but neither could establish permanent dominance until something changed the rules of the game. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a revolutionary set of technologies that made them far more effective hunters and gatherers, sophisticated spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy, bone needles that allowed them to create fitted clothing for cold weather, fish hooks and nets that opened up aquatic food sources. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production techniques for creating long, sharp cutting edges from small amounts of stone. These weren't just better tools, they were force, multipliers, technologies that allowed smaller groups of humans to achieve what had previously required much larger groups. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 people to take down a mammoth. A modern human group with spear throwers and coordinated tactics could do it with 8. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. Modern humans could maintain larger territories with smaller populations. They could survive in marginal environments that would challenge even robust Neanderthals. They could expand into new regions faster and establish permanent settlements more easily. The Neanderthals, who had survived the Ice Age through sheer physical toughness and close-knit group cooperation, suddenly found themselves outcompeted by a more technologically advanced species. But they didn't go down without a fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence between human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons. Modern human sites show evidence of fortification. Skeletal remains bear the marks of interpersonal conflict. This wasn't genocide, it was competition for the same resources by two species that were just similar. Enough to want exactly the same things: water sources, hunting grounds, shelter sites, raw materials for tools. And increasingly, the modern humans were winning. Not because they were stronger, Neanderthals were physically superior in almost every way, not because they were smarter, Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average, they won because they were more flexible. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting survival strategies for Ice Age Europe. They were incredibly good at what they did, but what they did was very specific. Modern humans, products of the African recovery period, had been selected for adaptability. They could change tactics quickly when circumstances changed. They could exploit new food sources. They could modify their tools and techniques to handle unfamiliar challenges. When the climate shifted, and it shifted constantly during this period, modern humans adapted. Neanderthals, locked into successful but rigid survival strategies, struggled. Slowly, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. First, they lost the prime territories, river valleys, coastal areas, the best hunting grounds. Then they were pushed into more marginal regions, mountain valleys, northern forests, areas that modern humans didn't want yet. By 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living in southern Spain and Gibraltar, isolated populations clinging to existence in refuges that were shrinking every year. Then they were gone. The story in Asia was different, but followed similar patterns. Modern humans encountered Denisovans sometime around 50,000 years ago. We know less about these meetings because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare. Most of what we know comes from genetic analysis, but the DNA tells a clear story. Like with Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants. Some Pacific Islander populations have as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry. Unlike the European situation, there seems to have been less direct competition between modern humans and Denisovans in Asia. The continent was vast enough that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for longer periods. Denisovans who had adapted to high altitudes continued living in the mountains. Those who had become seafaring specialists maintained control of island chains. Modern humans initially occupied different regions, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly competed with Denisovan territories. But eventually the same technological and demographic pressures that had eliminated Neanderthals began affecting Denisovans too. Modern humans were simply more efficient at exploiting resources. They could support larger populations in the same territories. They could expand faster and establish new settlements more easily. One by one, Denisovan populations were absorbed, outco-competed, or displaced. Some may have survived until surprisingly recently. There's tantalizing genetic evidence suggesting modern humans encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia as late as 25,000 years ago. But eventually they too disappeared as distinct populations. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were the only human species left on Earth. The descendants of those 180 bottleneck survivors had outlasted their evolutionary cousins who had also descended from the same ancestral population. The three-way split that had begun 800,000 years earlier was over. But why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovans failed? The answer brings us back to the bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had selected for very specific traits in all three species: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, adaptability. But the African population, the ancestors of modern humans, had faced one additional challenge that their European and Asian cousins had avoided. Africa had remained climatically unstable even after the worst of the crisis ended. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable patterns of Ice Age Europe and Denisovans specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to keep adapting to constantly changing conditions. Droughts that lasted decades, followed by periods of flooding, seasonal patterns that shifted every few generations, animal populations that appeared and disappeared unpredictably. This ongoing environmental pressure had kept modern humans evolutionarily flexible in ways that extreme specialization had not. When the three species finally encountered each other, Neanderthals and Denisovans were like finely tuned racing cars, incredibly efficient under the right conditions, but difficult to modify for new challenges. Modern humans were more like all-terrain vehicles, not as perfectly optimized for any single environment, but capable of handling whatever came next. This flexibility showed up in multiple ways. Technology. Modern humans innovated constantly, developing new tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals used essentially the same stone tool technology for over 200,000 years. It worked well, so they stuck with it. Social organization. Modern humans formed larger, more complex social networks. They could mobilize more people for big hunts or territorial conflicts. They developed trade relationships that moved resources across hundreds of miles. Demographics. Modern human populations could grow faster and recover more quickly from setbacks. When disease or climate disasters reduced a group's numbers, they bounced back within a few generations. Diet. Modern humans became extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to mammoth meat to processed plant foods. Neanderthals remained, focused on large game hunting, effective but vulnerable when climate changes affected prey populations. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans had developed more sophisticated communication abilities. The genetic bottleneck had created selection, pressure for complex language in all three species. But modern humans dealing with more variable environments and larger social networks had pushed verbal communication the furthest. They could coordinate large group activities more effectively. They could share complex technical knowledge more accurately. They could maintain relationships across greater distances and longer time periods. When modern humans encountered Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, they weren't just competing for resources, they were competing with a communication and organizational advantage that had been 400,000 years in the making. It wasn't a fair fight. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex societies. The population that had once numbered only 1,280 individuals now included millions of people speaking hundreds of languages. They had inherited all the survival skills that had carried their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they had also developed something new, something their evolutionary cousins had never quite achieved: the ability to not just adapt to their environment, but to reshape it entirely. The age of human dominance had begun, and it all traced back to those desperate millennia when survival hung by the thinnest possible thread, and somehow, impossibly, 1,280 individuals refused to give up. So here we are, 8 billion humans. Everywhere you look, Tokyo has 14 million people in the metro area. Laos has over 15 million. New York, London, Mumbai, São Paulo. Cities so massive they can be seen from space, glowing like galaxies against the dark earth. We've built the internet connecting every corner of the planet. We've mapped the human genome. We've sent robots to Mars and telescopes to the edge of the universe. We've created art that moves people to tears and music that makes strangers dance together. We are the most successful species in the history of life on Earth. And every single one of us, every person reading this, every child being born right now, every human who has ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,080 individuals who refused to give up 900,000 years ago. That's the part that stops you cold when you really think about it. Your DNA contains sequences that survived the worst climate disaster our lineage ever faced. Genes that were tested by 117,000 years of near extinction and came through. Chromosomes that fused under impossible pressure and somehow made us stronger. The way your brain works, the way you solve problems, the way you cooperate with strangers, the way you learn language, the way you care for your children, all of it was shaped by those desperate millennia when survival required every advantage imaginable. You're walking proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But this discovery means more than just a cooler region story. It explains so much about why humans are the way we are. Ever wonder why we're so much better at cooperation than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands, while chimpanzees max out at maybe 50 individuals? It's because our ancestors spent over 100,000 years in populations so small that cooperation wasn't just useful, it was the only way anyone survived. Individuals who couldn't get along with others died. Individuals who could share, teach, and work together lived long enough to pass on their genes. For 4,000 generations, natural selection was fine-tuning our capacity for collaboration. Ever wonder why humans are so obsessed with teaching? Why we spend years of our lives just showing children how to do things that other animals learn through trial and error? It's because during the bottleneck, losing knowledge when someone died could doom the entire group. Our ancestors, who were best at transferring information to the next generation, had better survival odds over millennia. This created the teaching instinct that lets human societies accumulate knowledge across generations. We didn't just survive the bottleneck, we became addicted to learning and sharing what we learned. Ever wonder why we're so good with tools? Why humans can use everything from stone hammers to smartphones, while even smart animals like dolphins only use tools in very limited ways? It's because tool making and tool use were literally life or death skills during the crisis years. Individuals who could innovate, who could figure out better ways to get food or make fire or build shelter, were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw materials for solving problems. But the bottleneck also explains some of our weaknesses. Ever wonder why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to other mammals? Why we get knocked out by viruses that barely affect other primates? It's because we lost 65% of our genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That includes a lot of immune system variants that might have protected us from pathogens. We're all much more genetically similar than we should be for a species our size, which makes us vulnerable to diseases that can exploit common genetic weaknesses. Ever wonder why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? It's because some of these disorders might have provided advantages during the bottleneck period, or they might be side effects of other traits that were selected for during the crisis. When you're down to 180 individuals, genetic quirks that would normally disappear can get locked into the entire species. We carry these scars of near extinction as well as the strengths. But perhaps the most profound implication is what this discovery tells us about human unity. Right now, in 2025, there are people who think racial differences between humans are meaningful in some biological sense. People who believe that populations that look different or speak different languages are fundamentally different types of humans. The bottleneck discovery obliterates that thinking completely. Everyone on Earth, literally everyone, descends from the same group of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. We've only been separated for a few tens of thousands of years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. The genetic differences between any two human populations are smaller than the differences you'd find within a single population of chimpanzees. We are all cousins, recent cousins. When humans migrated out of Africa 60,000 years ago and spread around the world, they carried bottleneck DNA to every continent. when they developed different skin colors and facial features to adapt to new climates, they were just expressing different combinations of the same underlying genetic toolkit, the Aboriginal Australians who reached their continent 50,000 years ago, the Europeans whose ancestors survived the Ice Age, the Polynesians who navigated across the Pacific using stick charts and star maps, the Native Americans who crossed into the Americas during the last glacial period, all carrying genes from those 1,280 survivors, all products of the same evolutionary crucible. There is no them, there's only us. And us has always been one family, shaped by the same history of survival against impossible odds. This has implications for how we think about modern challenges too. Climate change, for instance. Right now, we're facing another period of rapid environmental transformation. Not as severe as what our ancestors endured 900,000 years ago, but serious enough to threaten human civilization. The bottleneck discovery suggests we have reason for both concern and hope. Concern because past climate disasters have brought human populations to the brink of extinction. We're not invulnerable. We're not guaranteed to survive just because we're clever, but hope because we carry the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. The ancestors who made it through the bottleneck weren't just lucky. They were adaptable, innovative, cooperative. They were willing to completely change their way of life when circumstances demanded it. Those traits are still in us, the same flexibility that let our ancestors survive the transition from forest to savanna to desert. The same cooperation that held tiny populations together through millennia of crisis. The same problem-solving ability that developed new technologies when old approaches stopped working. We are not the same species that entered the bottleneck 130,000 years ago. We are the species that emerged from it, tested, refined, proven, capable of surviving conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal on the planet. But survival isn't guaranteed. It never was. The researchers who discovered the bottleneck, Wangju Yuanpan, Hipang Li, and their teams, they've given us more than just an amazing scientific discovery. They've given us a mirror. When we look at the genetic evidence of those 117,000 years of near extinction, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about ourselves. We are the species that doesn't give up, the species that finds ways to survive when survival seems impossible, the species that comes through disasters stronger and more capable than before. But we're also the species that can lose 99% of our population and spend over 100,000 years hanging on by our fingernails before things get better. The bottleneck is both a warning and a promise. A warning that human success is never guaranteed. That we've come closer to extinction than most people imagine. That our current dominance of the planet is not the inevitable result of being the chosen species, but the hard-won prize of ancestors who survived conditions that killed almost everything else. And a promise that we carry within our genes the capacity to survive almost anything, that we are descended from 1,280 individuals who looked at a world falling apart around them and decided to keep going anyway. Every time you solve a problem, you're using skills refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with strangers, you're expressing behavioral patterns that kept small groups alive for millennia. Every time you teach a child something new, you're participating in the knowledge-sharing traditions that carried crucial information across 4,000 generations of crisis. The 1,280 live on in US. Not metaphorically, literally, in our chromosomes, our neural patterns, our capacity for resilience. 900,000 years ago, it looked like the human story was ending. The climate had turned hostile. Most populations had died out. A tiny group of survivors faced a world that seemed determined to kill them. They survived, they adapted, they multiplied, they spread across the planet and became us. Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We've built cities that house millions, technologies that connect billions, art and music and literature that capture the full range of human experience. We are the descendants of the 1 through 80. We are living proof that sometimes when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. And if our ancestors could survive that, we can survive anything. The bottleneck is over, the expansion continues, and the story of those 1 through 180 survivors is